This is Duke University.
I can look back at Michael as I remembered him when I first met him, who was a scholar of German military history. Brilliant, yes, but quite traditional in his approach to military history. And today he visits us as a historian of human rights. And from the University of Chicago. And I'm thinking, well, what happened in between? Let me give you an idea of what happened in between. He's asked questions about war, civil war, genocide, formation of civil society. He's asked how intellectuals have shaped post-Cold War Germany. What causes civilians to stage insurrections against their government? How does public memory organize the vision of the past that inspires this activism? He's asked what traits were shared by Stalinism and Nazism. And you know, we never say Hitlerism, Stalinism and Nazism. He looks at how religious faith affects public culture in Germany, post-war Germany. And two questions I see as kind of guiding lights go back over your work is, first of all, and these are both questions that relate to human rights and what he's going to talk about today, is what obligations do we owe strangers? What are our moral obligations to strangers? And how is it people come together to form civil societies? But before turning over the mic to Michael, let me mention two animals, the hedgehog and the fox. How many of you have ever seen a hedgehog? Probably nobody, right? You can't see them. And do you have a concept of a hedgehog? How does a hedgehog?
This is Tinky Winkle from Peter Rabbit. She's a hedgehog.
Looks around, doesn't go very far. And everybody's seen a fox, but only briefly. What's a fox like? How does a fox
Very
look?
fast. Darts around all
Darts around. So there's the hedgehog and the fox. Now, some of you who are historians know why I'm going to say the hedgehog and the fox. And that is because a very distinguished intellectual named Isaiah Berlin said that intellectuals fall into two categories, hedgehog and the fox. And I would like to introduce Michael as a hybrid.
Oh my God, what animal is that?
And a fox. Well, think about it. And so a hedgehog knows one big thing and studies it in very careful detail. A fox knows many things, but it doesn't always go into so much detail. It has some big ideas, lots of them. And so Michael combines both. He attends to meticulous detail in archival work. He integrates his evidence into very big pictures indeed, and finds meaning where others have found chaos. And so I think he's the perfect person to talk about human rights after euphoria, after the enthusiasm for human rights is being challenged everywhere in the world. And with that, I'd like to introduce you to my colleague, the hedgehog and the fox. I won't steal your water.
Okay, that would be nice, yes. Thank you very much, Claudia. That was wonderful. I knew that I was a strange animal, but I didn't know that I was a cross between a hedgehog and a fox. But be that as it may, I would like to talk about human rights education after human rights idolatry, and what I will do is that I will talk mostly about human rights in the current conjuncture and set up some ideas what the problems are for human rights education at this point. We can go into the details, into the dollars and cents, how to organize a human rights program, questions and answers, or after my lecture. I mean, I've been doing this for a long time now, and we are at the point of revamping our program massively, and so the very practical issues of organizing a program are very much on my mind. But it is indeed the big picture that concerns me at the moment. The title itself, of course, is already full of references, as those of you who read in Matters Human Rights would instantly recognize. After human rights idolatry, of course, is a reference, hidden, not so hidden reference to Michael Ignatieff's Human Rights as Politics and Memory, his 2001 book, in which he had, for the first time, turned against, basically against human rights activism, a position that has become much more serious and much more stringent in recent years, effectively since he has been, he's been burned, of course, by Iraq badly, and he's been burned as liberal politician in Canada. So he's turned quite radically against social activism, and in this he is quite the opposite from the position Stephen Hopgood takes in his End Times of Human Rights, which points to what Michael Ignatieff also points to, and that is that we are in a period of an end time of human rights. But then basically argues and makes a powerful plea for a return to transnational humanitarian activism as a kind of secular religion, and argues that what we should do is leave behind the institutionalization of human rights in intermediate institutions such as the ICSC, the Committee of the Red Cross, or the International Criminal Court, because of their ossified leadership, that refers to the Red Cross, and because of their lack of democratic legitimacy. So he basically returns to a classic British humanitarian position, whereas the Canadian Michael Ignatieff turns to what actually is the achievement of Michael Ignatieff's life, and that is the Canadian Constitution. He turns to constitutionalism, right? I won't side with either position perfectly, but just to give, this gives you an idea what the context of my talk is, which starts indeed with a recognition of the remarkable rise of an international human rights regime in the present time. This international human rights regime is much younger than myth would have it, although it's very unclear who actually, apart from Sam Moyn, spells out that the myth, because the myth is more in the eyes of the beholder. There isn't much myth in the first place, but be that as it may, it is neither, this human rights regime is neither self-evidently timeless, universal rights, a sense of common humanity, and hence does not rest on an anthropological sense of humanity, or for that matter on an anthropological sense of justice, that is, in the sense that justice you find everywhere, hence human rights you might find it everywhere as well. It also is now quite well agreed that human rights is not an uncontested Western or modern regime that dates far back in time, whether you see that time beginning with the Enlightenment or whether you see it begin with Grotius and the School of Salamanca, or whether you even see it in the scholastic tradition. All these possibilities were offered. But I think while there are predecessors of the current regime, this regime is very modern indeed. And I for one, take as a starting point for the international human rights regime the UN Charter. For quite deliberately, and in this case in clear opposition and in clear contradistinction to Sam Moyn, who puts it much later, right? The UN Charter, because it incorporated the principle that, and I quote, the United Nations shall promote universal respect for and observance of human rights and fundamental freedoms, and committed its membership to, and I quote, joint and separate actions to achieve these goals. These goals were subsequently, of course, elaborated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, it is general consensus that nothing much came of this early proclamation of human rights in these two documents. They were buried in the multiple fronts of the Cold War, and perhaps more importantly of decolonization struggles. And in the context of decolonization struggles, in my opinion, less in the now much ballyhooed question of self-determination, and much more in the question of racial equality. The issue of racial equality has been the hidden agenda for human rights in the 20th century and has remained the hidden agenda for human rights in the 20th century into the 1980s and 1990s. It's only after what Sam Moyn considers the human rights revolution, actually it began to disappear, which I find very interesting and at the same time very problematic. Now, in the 1950s and 60s, contestation led to an effective blockage or paralysis that eased only in the 60s and 70s, partly in response to geopolitical shifts, détente, and partly in response to a new wave and a new kind of humanitarian mobilization. Nonetheless, these two documents do figure prominently in my reckoning, partly due to what they established in principle and partly due to historical precedent. So, what's new in these principles? First, the rights in these two documents were indeed universal, much to the chagrin of some of the leading human rights advocates like René Cassin, who had conniptions about having to acknowledge equal rights for colonial subjects. A very ugly moment in an otherwise illustrious career. Very sad case. But these two documents were important in that they made plain, established as a principle, that human rights did indeed apply to all human beings rather than only to citizens. This is also important, as did the rights of man, or only to specified vulnerable groups, as in the international humanitarian law. This would be Geneva, this is Refugee Convention, etc. So in that sense, this is in principle, and nothing more than in principle, a breakthrough. Second, it is often overlooked that the UN Charter and the UDHR did not just set limits of government actions, but imposed positive obligations on government actions. Now, this is something the United States would never agree on. Also, it eventually signed on to the Economic Convention and Social Convention, but clearly the principle was established in 1945, and it was not established it should be added by the United States. That is smuggled into the UN Charter as so many things, which is because it is a composite document. Moreover, it is also interesting that already the UN Charter obligated not just governments, but also, and I quote, all organs of society. So it was very much talking to well, what eventually, they thought, of course, of parties back then, but what eventually became the NGO sector, which just barely existed at the point. Last but not least, they were codified not only in national law, the laws and constitutions, but also these principles, but also in international law, with the explicit rationale of establishing a society of nations, rather than not simply a society of states, which again caused tremendous furor among the great powers, both the Soviet Union and the United States. And these principles were established, this should also be noted, with a specific purpose for this society, for this international society, and that is the maintenance of peace. That is the UN Charter, and as its effect, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, were not all-purpose documents, kind of general thin aspirations articulated or smuggled into a document of states. But this charter and the UDHR had the specific purpose and the specific rationale, which we could elaborate and explore. The specific purpose of it was the maintenance of peace. And I think that kind of targeted and, as you wish, sectoral human rights on an international level. It was not just all-purpose, everything human rights, but it was a purposive human rights agenda. Even if it's then wrong, you can argue against it, but that is really quite interesting. Now, the Bill of these Rights was spelled out in the UDHR and adopted by the UN General Assembly for promotion by the UN, by nations, and by all organs of society. We might say that for 20, 30 years, not much came of the UN Charter stipulations, and not much came of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But this does not diminish the importance of the UN Charter or the UDHR, and the reason becomes evident if we think of a very famous precedent for this. So the question is, you see, this is kind of all still arguing in a way with Sam Moyn, who says really all that matters is the 1970s and 80s, and it's the social mobilization for human rights. I think the fact that the principle is established does matter, and that it is elaborated and encoded in an international convention or a charter, or respectively a declaration. And why? Think of it this way. The principle of equality, and for that matter of happiness, did not amount to much after it was established as self-evident truth in the Declaration of Independence. Equality disappeared from the agenda. Happiness, in case you overlooked this, only reappeared in the 2009 inaugural speech of Obama, right? And even then, it disappeared again. But that's when it reappeared for the first time. And yet, the Declaration of Independence was not judiciable. It was not indeed followed up in any way, direct way, in the Constitution making, in the Bill of Rights, because one of the key elements, equality, massively dropped out, and other things dropped out as well. And yet, and this is the point I want to make, it became the foundational reference point for the abolition of slavery, for the abolition of slavery struggle, for the Emancipation Declaration, and for the 13th and especially the 14th Amendments of the US Constitution. The fact that the right of equality was declared and for that matter, the right of fraternity, and that's the way I interpret the happiness clause, right, which is a little different from the Lockean interpretation, but that's neither here nor there. The fact that this principle was declared made it possible to that it could be followed up. And if you look at the different histories of the abolition movement in Great Britain, on one hand, and in the United States, where equality became constitutionalized, of course with effects that then are unpredictable again, and it took another 100 years to actually put Constitution into law, civil rights in the 1960s, and voting rights, right? Still, the very fact that it was there as a principle made it possible half a century later, or more than half a century later, to actually translate this into a constitutional practice. So while principles being encoded may not matter at the time, they are important as beacons and as reference points to which you can return. And I think in terms of the principles of human rights as articulated in the UN Charter with the purpose of preserving peace, and as adumbrated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, those principles will have stayed with us and rather steadily have become more important. I think they haven't fulfilled their well, we know they haven't fulfilled their mission, and they haven't led to an working international society. But that's where the problem of human rights begins in our time. Now, once we argue this, we can then readily acknowledge that the human rights mobilization, the rise of human rights was an affair of the late 20th, of international human rights, I should say, was an affair of the late 20th century. And I see three main currents or aspects of this development. First current is the emergence of a very rapidly growing humanitarian movement. This is probably the single most important movement in the context of human rights, humanitarian mobilization, often underestimated, and certainly more recently under heavy fire of critique, because it is so inefficient, so self-serving, and so impotent in the face of the actual emergencies that we face. But what we got is a rapidly growing humanitarian movement or movements, with Amnesty International's Prisoner of Conscience campaign being one starting point, and the emergency medical aid for Biafra being the other one. That's of course crucial for the Médecins Sans Frontières. Humanitarianism had, of course, a long and grand history reaching far back into the 19th century, but it is only in the 60s and in the 70s that it jettisoned its imperial leanings, because humanitarianism was an imperial movement in the 19th century, and we can deal with it at length, that's easy. And it was sprung loose from the state, or states, Red Cross, and more importantly, perhaps from church, and charity moorings, in order to rekindle a social movement with an ever-changing shape that grew explosively in the last quarter of the 20th century into the present, and may have reached its kind of apogee in Haiti. I mean, that is clearly, if we talk about turning points, that is clearly one of the sobering turning points of that movement. But still, this is one very powerful current. Now, I, for one, would separate from the humanitarian mobilization the mobilization of self-proclaimed human rights civil society organizations, which also took off in the late 60s and more so in the 70s and 80s, and have grown into a worldwide network of some 11,000 organizations at the turn of the millennium. The role of these organizations in promoting human rights campaigns against tyranny and injustice has been the subject of an entire branch of social science, global justice, transitional justice. More recently, the focus has shifted in an interesting way to the importance of these human rights organizations in the vernacularization of rights, that is, in the local re-articulation of very abstract human rights in the everyday existence of minorities, of refugees or women. And so the vernacularization of rights thought and rights talk has become partly a new focus of human rights organizations, certainly a focus of human rights scholarship in political science, where much of it is at. Still, the effect of this mobilization has also been quite stunning, although, you know, when we look more carefully, maybe it has been kind of overestimated by an activist political science, how much it actually has done to bring down the military dictatorship in South Korea, or for that matter, the actual military dictatorships in Latin America, is up for dispute. Still, they were there. They were a beacon of hope for all people involved in it. Last but not least, I think, and that should not be forgotten, as a new moment of the 1970s international human rights regime. It is only in the 1970s that human rights has actually entered American politics and foreign politics at that, as human rights. Of course, the United States had a venerable civil rights mobilization. But human rights, when it came in, and this is Mark Bradley's new work on the subject, was indeed an alien force. It came in as an alien term and had to be vernacularized into American politics with very dubious and ambivalent results. Of course, this human rights turn is result of the advantageous moment of the 1970s, at which American policymakers were in search for new legitimating strategies at home and abroad, very clearly. Be this as it may, the human rights had become an aspect, and it may even be argued has been mainstreamed in American politics. We might add that this mainstreaming has been far more the case in Europe. It's an increasing sidebar for European historians that it is so difficult to convince anyone of the dramatically growing importance of human rights principle and human rights practices in Europe. It's not simply, and perhaps least of all, a result of the fact that human rights have become the pillar and reference point of the European Union foreign policy. It's simply because European foreign union policy doesn't exist very much. However, it is rather more important, and this really does matter, that human rights have become in the 1990s and 2000 the main criterion for accession to the European Union, and may well become the main criterion for the de-accession or suspension of European Union membership, as in the case of Hungary. That this is not simply a matter of the judiciary, but of policy and politics is what really matters in this case. Let me add just as a fourth point to not on Europe, but to introduce a fourth current, and that is the rise, of course, of a transnational judiciary. And here, not just in Europe, here not just in war crimes tribunals, but surprisingly and startlingly understudied, although there is a new study of a scholar at Northwestern now emerging, in Africa, where transnational human rights-based adjudication was absolutely crucial in the transition from the kind of from these wild regimes of the 1980s and 90s to the more steady regimes of the present. So, the long and the short of this is, and this is really what I wanted to convey, is there appears to be not only a surfeit of human rights talk and advocacy, but also an impressive array of human rights instruments and institutions as both national and international law. Human rights are backed up by a significant humanitarian and philanthropic mobilization. Even in the denial of human rights, we might nowadays find the acknowledgement of the global reach of the human rights rhetoric, although the latter argument is a stretch. But if you think of the desperate effort of tyrants to actually defend themselves with human rights, and not just tyrants, but of the American government and the Israeli government, then you have good cases. Human rights are anchored in a global culture of rights and have largely withstood the particular challenges of the past century, the late past century, like Asian values. Further, some human rights law is jus cogens, non-derogable international law. And while this jus cogens has been openly challenged, as in the war on terror, the ensuing debate has rather advanced the notion of global norms and standards, and has in fact reinforced the idea that while the Americans may derogate, it does not diminish the actual principle of the law. That stands, and that is interesting, that the strongest power, and that is that might, cannot alter right at this point. That's the reality, and that, I think, is the remarkable achievement of the human rights mobilization of the past 40 years. Crucial in this mobilization was the kind of social activism of segments of society, but as crucial is the institutionalization, and underestimated by the more social mobilization oriented people like Hopgood. As crucial is the institutionalization of these principles. These are no longer beacons, but these are now norms that are actively used in what always will be the case with human rights, and that is, it is a debate and it's a contestation over what is and what human rights is and what human rights does. So this idea of jus cogens as non-derogable right is, of course, a very legal one. But as soon as it enters the politics of public debate and of international debate, it becomes instantly very important. Now, to give you an example of this, there is that strange Article 3 of the Geneva Convention, which is actually not a human rights document, but a humanitarian document, a document of humanitarian law. Article 3, I mean, you or I read it and read over it umpteen times before 2000. I started to teach human rights before 2000. So it was part of my lecture, it was in there, and it was a curiosity. But who would have thought that the American government would slip over Article 3? because they had the hardest time arguing against the fact that Article 3 of the Geneva Convention, which they didn't believe in, which they explicitly argued, nonetheless established that torture was impermissible under all circumstances, right? So the point is that in codified texts have consequences. And this would be one of them, which is simply to argue as much as we should celebrate and should study the power of social mobilization, social activism, human rights activism. The institutionalization of human rights is a little more or a lot more important than people like Stephen Hopgood would argue. These are the framing devices for argument, for legitimation strategies, which no one, neither the Chinese nor the Russian or the Indian or the American government, can fully escape. So, if all this is so, if this is such a wonderful state affair, what's the problem? Well, before I go on to ask what is wrong with this picture, let me make a very brief excursus into a distant past of a first human rights regime. I don't want to engage in the question whether human rights are actually a human rights regime or not. That's a matter for another debate. But what I'm interested in is the fact that this regime came about as the result of an explosive and quite literally revolutionary rise of human rights rhetoric and human rights politics from the 1770s to 1800, and virtually disappeared and or was destroyed, again quite literally, only to reappear piecemeal after horrific struggle. The most horrendous example, of course, being the Civil War. For the purpose of my presentation, one point is of interest here. Peculiar human rights, or more properly rights of man regime, grew explosively in the 30 years between 1770s to 1800, only to disappear almost completely as rights of man mobilization after 1800. We might argue that it has shapeshifted into humanitarianism, but the most powerful humanitarian mobilization occurred in Great Britain at exactly the moment in which Great Britain, in the context of the Revolutionary Wars and the anti-Napoleonic Wars, had literally destroyed the human rights activists as Jacobins. So humanitarianism does not grow naturally out of human rights mobilization, but humanitarianism in Great Britain is the product of the destruction of a radical human rights mobilization. Liberal democracies, and certainly the British democracy, the Whiggish democracy, is not pro-human rights. In France, of course, the home of the rights of man, human rights only reappeared as a social mobilization in the late 19th century. It completely vanished from the scene, and it became, indeed, entered the Constitution only in 1946. So it took a very long hiatus. The destruction was very thorough. Human rights did not disappear as individual rights, but as selected individual rights. They reappeared as selected individual rights that were basically slated into various constitutions and shifted from constitution to constitution. Human rights packages disappeared. Social and economic rights, fraternity, solidarity issues were completely eviscerated, to the point that then an entire political science of human rights argues that there are first, second, and third generations of human rights, whereas in fact, first, second, and third generations were well articulated in the 1790s. But quite a lot of these rights were literally destroyed together with their with their advocates. Think of this not in too highfalutin a term. Destruction means physical destruction. Not well, in the counter-revolution in France, but certainly in Poland, very massively in Poland, and very massively in Sicily and the two kingdoms. In Naples, you have a fundamentalist Catholic mobilization that effectively eradicates and kills human rights advocates. That is one of the grand battle sites. Naples is one of the grand battle sites of the human rights battle around 800. Think of Spain, 1812 Constitution of Cadiz. It's not just that one of the most human rights-centered constitutions in Europe. It's not just that the constitution disappeared, but the people disappeared with them. That is, the people who actually wrote them. So there is, human rights is, to some extent, not simply transformed. It does not simply shift time, but it's shift focus, but it is destroyed. Meaning, and this is the lesson I want to bring in, human rights, even as a very successful mobilization, is indeed a phenomenon that can come and go, and that is, it can be made to exit. Human rights produces massive opposition. It's not simply contested, but it is fought over. And human rights is not simply, as we might argue, and as Lynn Hunt and many others argue now, will succeed in the long run. But while it may succeed in the long run, you have to notice that in the short run, the human rights activists were literally dead. So that's the that's what you have to keep in mind in terms of human rights. It is a very rupturous, it is a highly contested, and it is indeed an embattled system of ideas and practices. Do we see indications that we are, in this sense, in end times of human rights today? Yes, I do think we see them. On the surface, of course, things could not be more different. However, the question is whether, in spite of the rich and diverse regime of human rights law, the special social and political reality of human rights reflects a devaluation and indeed a beginning disappearance of human rights. Hopwood thinks the problem is really the ossification of institutions. I think the problem is the gathering of an ever more massive opposition against human rights, and it's a fundamental systemic opposition against human rights, and this is, I think, what then human rights education is up against. So, Where are we? First of all, very clearly we should notice that human rights has its enemies. Not just opponents, but its enemies. Not just hypocrites, but sworn enemies who reject human rights outright. Starting at home, these are the legal theorists and the legal establishment who question the legitimacy of human rights, of international human rights outright, and restrict American obligations strictly to those defined by the Constitution. They also reject the use of any precedent from foreign courts in findings of American courts in contradistinction to what had been the practice in the American past. So against their own precedent, they set up a new precedent. Second, very clearly, if we look at the proliferation of conventions, and there are now hundreds, that is, there is a solid international law, we will notice that very key countries have not signed on. International Criminal Court is not signed on by the United States, that is a sworn enemy of it, but also Russia, also China, but also the other great democracy, and that is India, and also Brazil. That is, key nations have not signed on because of their belief in sovereign prerogative. So sovereign prerogative has become a very key issue, to the point that the great powers, the great global powers and the emerging global powers have indeed, in fact, been very hesitant to sign on, except to the most innocuous of conventions, and even then they basically take back in the footnotes, in their amendments, what they sign on in the text. So that's one very significant problem. Second, there are also cultural relatives who argue that peoples want different rights, and hence there cannot be a human rights culture. As in 1800s, it's the intellectuals and the critical intellectuals as much as the conservatives who are at the forefront of challenging human rights. These critics today tend to think of themselves on the left, but have their equivalent on the right in cultural conservatives who hold that we should not have some of the rights that advocates of human rights have labeled universal, such as the equality of women and of sexual minorities, or voting rights, or the abolition of the death penalty. Last but not least, there is the war on terror constituency among defense intellectuals and in popular politics that believes that national security under all circumstances trumps due process, rights of humans to inviolability, and in fact justifies torture. Women's human rights continue to come under attack at home and abroad among fundamentalist communities. There is a wholesale challenge by authoritarian states, in this case China would be the primary example, on the way we define emerging norms for such issues as information security, the right of civil society to congregate and organize, and that is the right, in this case, the right to organize for religious ends. More generally, the refusal to engage proactively in fields which require urgency international and transnational regulations, such as the international humanitarian law, the international criminal law, or international public health law, have reached critical levels. Even when statutes and conventions are passed by international bodies like the UN, they are instantly muted by the fact that key countries do not accede to them and indeed outright reject them. The ICC, as I mentioned, is the classic case for it. And of course, last but not least, as in all of these situations, human rights movements can shoot themselves into their foot when they stretch the norms too far and thus dilute the original principle, indeed forget the purpose of the regime. Purpose of the regime once upon a time was maintaining peace. So the slogan of 1993, the Vienna Conference, all rights for everybody, right, is a seriously troubling principle. Not simply because the slogan doesn't mean anything and it's unenforceable even in the best of all worlds, but because it has lost out of sight what the purpose of this current international human rights regime is. So let me repeat what this current regime of international human rights regime is for. It was set up and still supposed to function in order to create a safer world, a world of peace for individuals and entire societies. It has done so with reference to a higher law, international human rights, that provide a legal and political frame, ideally a rule of law, for ascertaining safety and security of individuals and societies, and for identifying, punishing abusers where they may be. And this regime has been effective inasmuch as it was not left to states, but advanced by civil society, actors in concert across the world. This said, first and foremost, all of this has come under attack, and second, it clearly has not been achieved its end. Chance to improve the actual politics of improving peace could rather be seen as receding. War, well, there is a big debate, of course, whether war and mayhem and violence is actually decreasing or increasing, but clearly the international community is incapable of acting as a concert, as a society of nations in response to emergencies, in response to civil wars, and in response to challenges, to the point, and this is not just the case for Syria, that it cannot even agree on what had been the self-evident default position, and that is humanitarian aid as opposed to human rights procedures. So, the reality is indeed far more mixed and far more troubling than it might appear. And if you give me another 5 minutes, I give you an explanation why I think this is so. And this is a more theoretical. Exploration, and it starts, I think, with a quote from Hannah Arendt, who, despite herself, has some very good ideas about universal human rights. She argues in The Origins of Totalitarianism, actually, in that famous chapter on human rights. The fundamental deprivation of human rights is manifested, and this is 1940s, right? But I think it speaks to today. The fundamental deprivation of human rights is manifested first and above all in the deprivation of a place in the world which makes opinions significant and actions effective. Classic Hannah Arendt, right? Not the loss of specific rights, this or that right, but the loss of community, willing and able to guarantee any rights whatsoever, has been the calamity which has befallen ever-increasing numbers of people. Man, it turns out, can lose so-called rights of man without losing his essential quality as man, his human dignity. Only the loss of a polity itself expels him from humanity. Now, I'm coming very much to the end of my talk, so let me just conclude with a final sentence. The problem of human rights today is not the derogation of one or the other rights, although that's bad enough. It's not the opposition and the debate over human rights. That's part of the business of human rights. We are debating what it is and what it does. But the fact that we cannot get together despite what effectively are global norms, a community of nations or a community of societies in a world in which social, political, and economic reproduction is a global reality. That is the problem of today. Hence, the challenge of human rights education, in my opinion, is to figure out how we can do global community building. This, I think, is the very foundation of human rights. Because I second Hannah Arendt, whatever we do in terms of social mobilization, whatever we do in terms of institutional development of conventions and so on and so forth, if we do not have, if we cannot even any longer presume to have a community of nations and a workable community of nations, if we are indeed in a in a neo-Westphalian system of warring states, of mutually exclusive warring states, as Stephen Hopwood argues, then indeed we have a problem. Now, Stephen Hopwood sees the solution in the classic turn to humanitarianism. In a situation in which there is no longer agreement to work together, even in a minimal fashion, in this situation, basically what you do is mobilize humanitarian activism. What I think is certainly the solution and the challenge for human rights education is to think through the problem of educating a student body, and for that matter, educating a nation for global community building. And that begins with simple things. We do need to know the conventions, at least the crucial ones. We do need to know the principles. We do need to know the social actors. And we do need to know how we actually fit together. Because the destruction of the bonds of togetherness, which are very real and material in a global community, the destruction of the imagination of those bonds, that, I think, is the actual challenge of, that is the actual consequence of 30 years or 40 years of neoliberal global politics. So that's, I think, where we are, and that's where I would like to end.
I love that way you ended that, and this whole idea of building community as a place of unrecognized importance for human rights. I think that's an incredible point. I have a program in Northern Ireland where I bring students every year to spend 8 weeks in Belfast. And there's no more obvious an example of a divided community, and divided on the stupidest of reasons, just this Protestant Catholic thing, and whatever that is, whatever that is. I mean, that's a very superficial way of saying it, but and but the idea of it's kind of insoluble in a way. I mean, many generations will have to pass before there's a sense of community and shared purpose in a place like Belfast, in a place like Chicago, or a place like Milwaukee, which is the most segregated city in the United States. And I'm thinking, when I talk to my Northern Irish colleagues, we talk about how for instance, right now in Northern Ireland, the school system is 98% segregated. So almost 100% of kids go to either Catholic or Protestant schools. And we were talking about the American example, where there was a forced integration from above. You know, the federal government, the court said, you have to integrate. But that hasn't happened in Northern Ireland. Essentially, the government has said, be separate. We'll give you both money, but be separate. And I'm just wondering, in a case like that where, you know, with the American, this is kind of a confused question, so I'm sorry, but in some ways you could argue that the American experience with human rights wasn't community-based. In fact, if we had let it be community-based, we would still be deeply segregated, because people, like here in Durham, we would have chosen separate school systems. And in fact, after Brown versus Board of Education, they had to have another decree in 1974 that said, you southern cities that are resegregating along city, black, county, white schools, cut it out. You know, you have to come together as a community and figure out a way to integrate. But that didn't happen from the grassroots coming up. It happened from the top down. And I'm just wondering what that the American Civil Rights Movement, how does that fit in with your idea of community building when the government takes such a powerful role in essentially saying that you communities cannot have what you want. There's a higher goal here, and that higher goal is integration. And just how that fits with your idea of community building.
That fits perfectly well with my assessment of the situation, but I don't think human rights are anti-state, and I think the problem of Hopgood and of Moyne to some extent is that they are so skeptical of they think of human rights as setting, creating spaces against the state. My argument is a much more classic rights of man argument, and that is human rights is framing what states can do and cannot do, and in fact,
must do, right? That's a positive.
I think that is what is needed. A community needs to act. Now, how that state looks like can be debated, whether that's the kind of state of the Stalinist variety, you know, the kind of massive or corporate variety, if you wish. I rather doubt it. But without power, you cannot frame. And it is the kind of the fusion of, to use the classic early modern term of jus and dominium, right and might, if you like. That is the trick of successful human rights, successful human rights politics. Now, that's one thing. So, I mean, there is. I think my sense is, thinking of solutions without the state is a desperate measure. I mean, if you have lost all hope in a state, then you're really in trouble. I mean, that's kind of emergency politics. I understand it. There are moments when you cannot appeal to a state and you have to act very clearly. And then you have to act on your own. And what you do then is kind of be a heroic or sacrificial witness, right? And that's beautiful, but you know, not everyone can be a Bonhoeffer, and a Bonhoeffer doesn't change the world, you know, to use a German example. I mean, he changes the world as a model, but he does not make the world a different place, except through his model quality. So the state for me is part of the solution. Second, I think The problem with separation, with segregation, is not simply the deep ancient divisions. Now, I do not. I've kind of come to soften on that a little because after Bosnia, I mean, so many people kind of argued, especially in the American media establishment and in the American government under Clinton, for these ancient divisions. And I come from a country where we overcame ancient divisions quite successfully. And the first ancient division is between two ethnics, the Württembergers and the Badeners. That is, it's a very local affair, and nobody knows about them here, but doesn't matter. They are just two neighboring ethnics. They didn't like each other forever. Neither did we like the French, but you can come together, and it takes work. But I think that debate is churning round and round and round. But the more interesting and the more challenging problem is that indeed there are situations in which superfluous populations, to use Hannah Arendt terms, are literally created or have been inherited. That is, populations which are not connected in a kind of division of labor that makes up a community. As soon as you have that situation, you have a problem. And overcoming that problem, where you have an actual lack of community at the very structurating level, right? Because two sides are not part of the same world, literally in the sense that there is nothing that would facilitate interaction between them. That is a serious case. Now, I think at that situation, what you have to do as an intellectual is first and foremost actually look very carefully. Where are the interactions? Because neighbors never kind of do not interact in one way or the other. And where can you change that interaction? That's not the state. That's kind of neighborhood work. This is community organizing, right? Very practically, very real, but very consequential. That is for the kind of university intellectuals or more general intellectuals, a question of mapping connections, that is, and mapping means also reimagining connection. Where can you imagine the really existing border zones where people interact? How can you identify the people who actually make the way back and forth? There are always people like that. It's that kind of work you can kind of insert with some steroids, intellectual steroids or imaginative steroids. And I think that's work that is slow. It has not the cachet of grand human rights, convention building, but that's the vernacular of human rights. That's where it happens, and it's the kind of everyday work of human rights that I think we have to also prepare for. And third, for the super intellectuals at Duke and at Chicago, there's always the reality, the theoretical work of figuring out how such superfluous populations are created. That is a question of racism, if you wish, more generally speaking, but you would have to think very much more deeply. It can be the condition of a political economy today. I would very much think that we are producing superfluous populations within the United States massively today, and here in Duke as well as here in Durham as well as in Chicago. That requires a kind of intellectual apparatus which in and of itself is very abstract labor. It's academic or intellectual labor which has no immediate practical consequence in the sense, you can't go out into the street and say, this is the way it works. But it is nonetheless, part of a human rights mobilization that speaks to your problem. And inasmuch as the Northern Irish problem was kind of placated and overcome, it is because of the combination of all those factors, and because some of the mistakes, the obvious political institutional mistakes that were made in Bosnia-Herzegovina were not made in Northern Ireland. Now, we could discuss what those mistakes were in Bosnia-Herzegovina, what the problems of the Dayton Accord were, and why the Dayton Accord still exists. But those are then, those get us into the nitty-gritty of politics. But the principles is really, you can build change, both from the theory down and from the community building up. But the key is not kind of ancient hatreds, but it is really the issue of finding kind of connections between communities, and the issue, theoretically speaking, is one of superfluous populations.
Yeah, hi. So thank you very much, Professor Geyer, for that talk. I have 2 questions to ask you.
I'm coming close because my hearing is really...
All right, I'll speak louder.
That would be very much appreciated.
So don't worry. So I have 2 kind of questions that I think are in the challenging mode, but are in a friendly challenging mode. So the first question is, how important to you is the political economy of human rights? So I think of the political economy of human rights.
Okay. To
really get into the question of the way in which money and power interact. And didn't hear you talk about money and where money is, like states as opposed to, corporations, and the way that, in fact, we need our states so that we can deal with our corporations would be one of the things to take it in that direction. But I'm just really interested in how you deal with the political economy question. And the second different question entirely is, I'm teaching tomorrow a really interesting case for me on Indigenous people's rights. And I am actually really surprised by how much people like James and Naya have actually accomplished in a Pollock kind of format where they just keep throwing things up against the wall and some of it sticks, right? So, I think of this as a success, the United Nations Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the African Commission on Human and People's Rights coming down with this big decision, Underwood case in 2010. There's just a lot of success where people went from being nullius, terra nullius, they themselves, they didn't even have a name, they were not terra nullius, to being real, not just subjects, but authors of their own rights. So how does that work in the decline of human rights?
It is one of the examples of a very successful mobilization. The irony is that it is perhaps one of the most successful mobilizations, in the sense that it clearly affects masses of people and concrete peoples. But at the same at the same time, it is a group rights issue rather than an individual rights issue. So it's everything. The kind of post-70s human rights mobilization was not supposed to do, and yet it is exactly, namely advancing group rights, and yet it is exactly that is successful. So let's just live with it, with that part, and agree with you. I agree with you about the remarkable success of that regime. And switch over, with that example in mind, into the political economy. Because where it really hasn't functioned, and quite in a way I've described the first human rights regime, where it hasn't functioned is in terms of kind of copyright issues of about herbs and medicines and so on and so forth. The protection of those rights as kind of intellectual rights. That has not worked. That is, where it is law, as in Brazil, the law is simply flaunted. And if you look where it isn't law, you will find, let me suggest that you look at Canada with one of the otherwise most marvelous protections of minority populations in its constitution, right? And the setup of a kind of a mechanism of adjudication where, you know, human rights law and indigenous law conflict, like women's issues, right? So you have a mechanism, and it's a remarkable mechanism, but when it comes to political economy, it falls woefully short. So, yes, I've avoided the entire issue of neoliberalism and what neoliberalism does, neoliberal globalizing economy, what it does and how it relates to human rights. All I can say is that we have, that you have law professors at your very own university here who are working on that issue. And Sam Moyne will come out with a big essay. He has advertised. It isn't out yet, so we'll see what he has to say. It is emerging as the crucial issue. My argument, the way I would tie it in, has less to do with regulating money, not even with regulating property. But what I would argue is that the political economy destroys community faster than anything else. So I would indeed make a less economic argument and a more political argument in the political economy. And if I were to write that essay, I would pursue that track of the destruction of communities, the creation of superfluous populations, as the key issues of our times. And I think that also leads to what Didier Fassin calls the dominance of the emergency paradigm, because what we have is indeed, that is the kind of destruction of community kind of situation I would say is the foremost concern of a political economy of the past 40, 50 years. The big question is in how far human rights aided, a certain human rights aided and abetted this kind of regime, or in how far it opposed it. And I think what seems clear to me is that human rights activists haven't really, surprisingly, raised this question as one of their central concerns. Now, I would have to really look more carefully if that is really true, because there is so much argued, but I haven't seen it emerging as a key issue. What I notice is a kind of single issue concern, that is, you know, you have this right, that right, and the other right, but no longer concern for the kind of principle. And that, I think, is a problem.
I'm sorry to, just one more point. I will bring to supper tonight a good book, a really full-length book on this point. But I think this question of whether the purpose of the human rights regime is peace is very implicated in how we take on board political economy. Because if your idea of peace is just about the conditions of order, or if your idea of peace has a positive peace notion where people have to have well-being, right?
But for that, you simply can go back to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and even to the UN Charter. You will see that it's a much more enlightened document than anyone makes it out to be, because it's very clearly, has clearly that very broad understanding of what peace entails. Peace always entails also social justice. It also always entails economic justice. So, in terms of charters, we are on solid ground. It's just that things do get forgotten, like equality in like the issue of equality in the Declaration of Independence, and it's a matter of bringing them back alive. That's really the challenge. So in that sense, we have more enlightened documents than people, and often more enlightened documents than human rights activists as well. Oh.
Thank you very much, Harper. That
Pleasure.
was wonderful.
Produced by Duke University, online at duke.edu.